If you've followed Limbus Company stuff for pretty much any length of time, you're probably aware of how there's often a fair bit of bugs that pop up pretty much every other update. And I don't mean this kind. Patch notes usually have a page or two just listing a bunch of random fixes that have been made for all sorts of weird things that manage to break somewhere, either from the most recent update or often things that have been broken for a significant amount of time. I've been playing Limbus Company since the minute it released, and thanks to that, I've witnessed all sorts of funny glitches across its entire lifespan. I thought it'd make for an interesting experience to go back and take a look at many of these bugs, ranging from minor visual errors to balance-breaking exploits, so I've compiled a bunch of the most memorable Limbus bugs for this video. If there are other memorable glitches that you remember from Limbus's past, feel free to leave them in the comments below. There's been a lot of them in Limbus's lifespan, so I'm sure there's plenty of real funny ones that I've managed to completely forget about and will be mad at myself for forgetting so. But otherwise, feel free to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy this kind of thing. But without further ado, let's get started with some of the incredible bugs from early Limbus. One of the bugs that was present from the very start of the game was a visual bug that would occur at the loadout screen. The visual bug would result in most, if not all, of the sinners replaced by a very incorrect version of 7 Yi-Song. They all had 7 Yi-Song's Uptype 3 portrait, but were captioned LCB Sinner in Korean, despite the game being set to English. They all possess an unusual grey Uptype 1 border, which isn't used in-game, as normally it's either brown, red, or gold, depending on the rarity. They're shown as being 3 stars, and were level 35, keeping in mind that this was back when level 30 was the cap. And for some reason, all of them except for Faustslot had Gregor's Sinner icon and the support unit tag. Overall, just a mishmash of so many very wrong details, but that isn't where the story ends. The real infamy of the glitch is how it kept on happening. The insight it showed was an image from March of 2023, but here's a screenshot from the following August, where almost the exact same thing happened, only difference being this time Faustslot got slowly converted and partially Yi-Song did as well. And if you want an image that's got quite a few differences from the prior ones, if we take a look at this one from November, you can see the Forced Force Sinners managed to go unaffected. However, the 7 Yi-Song subtitles are using Sync Dawn's subtitle, I guess specifically South, in English, as opposed to the Korean LCB title. As far as I'm aware, it did keep on happening for at least some time afterwards, but I don't know just how long it lasted. What I do know is that I haven't seen the glitch for a good time now, so it seems like PM finally figured out the problem and patched it out for good. As far as what the problem was, since Yi-Song is the first Sinner and 7 is the first 2-star identity, it seems to have been used as a placeholder, and sometimes this placeholder would overtake all the Sinners. Same for the Korean LCB Sinner subtitle, and the generic unused border. It ended up being a fairly minor issue overall, as simply restarting the game would cause everything to go back to normal, but there were a few occasions where it would prevent you from going into combat until you did such. It's very funny to think about this glitch, because it was the kind of thing where you'd see some news screenshotted happening basically every other week for the first year or so of Limbus' lifespan, and I do feel oddly nostalgic for it. Very funny for a bug that I never actually experienced firsthand. For another early Limbus bug, albeit one that only managed to last 2 or 3 weeks into the launch of the game, we have to take a look at one of the ego gifts from the very first Mirror Dungeon, Eclipse of Scarlet Moths. This EO gift is fairly simple, just making it so that half of the damage dealt by the first skill used each turn is repeated on a random enemy, or 2 random enemies for a lust skill. However, there was a very funny and unique bug with it near the start of Limbus, in which this next turn damage would carry over between fights. I remember that I personally noticed this fairly early on, and I would intentionally try and end fights with a strong lust skill being used first, usually with Shidon's skill 3, Overbreathe. This was early enough that I don't have my own footage of it occurring, as I only started recording my Mirror Dungeon runs a month or so into the game's lifespan, so here's a very, and I mean very, high quality recreation of my strategy. With Overbreathe being a 28 rolling lust skill, thanks to a little bug at the time, consistently, I'd use it to finish off fights and hit 2 enemies with a large sum of damage as soon as I went into the next fight. There weren't too many super strong Lust skills back then, with the only Lust skill 3s being Base Heathcliff, Shidon, Kurokuma Ryoshu, and G-Corp Gregor, and I hadn't known either of the latter two until after this bug was patched out, so Shidon was the best bet I had. There were also some Lust egos, but this was back before ego resources carried over consistently between fights in Mirror Dungeon, having between times, so egoing wasn't as effective a spam strategy. Of course, this bug could just be exploited with non-Lust skills, but only for a single enemy instead of two taking the damage, making it significantly less funny. And before long, the bug had been patched out. I didn't even really know that it was a bug when I was making use of it back then, although it definitely makes sense that it was patched out, funny as it was. Sanity is kind of an important mechanic in Limbus. High sanity means your skills roll is better, which means you win more clashes, you do more damage, all pretty good stuff. But for the first month and a half of Limbus, sanity was very bugged in a very major way. Now, how sanity works is it ranges from -45 to 45, which definitely can seem like an odd set of boundaries for someone who isn't super familiar how it works, but it's pretty simple. All it indicates is how much the odds differentiate from a 50-50 heads chance. At 45 sanity, you get 50 plus 45, so you have a 95% heads chance. And at -45 sanity, it's the inverse, so it brings you all the way down to a 5% heads chance. For example, in the mid-ranges, if you are at, say, 30 sanity, you have an 80% heads chance. All of this, however, is only how it's supposed to work. If we take a look at the patch notes from the April 6, 2023 update, better known as being the Refraction Railway 1 update, there's a little bug fix listed down in the middle of a bunch of other fixes, just kinda thrown down there as if it's nothing too major. Fixed an issue where applied values of sanity-based coin flip chance modifiers were lower than intended. Up until this update, heads chance actually capped at 70% instead of the intended 95%. And as you could probably imagine, this resulted in a very different game experience taking place beforehand. There was so much more reliance on luck for every single skill, as sanity only did so much for you. While you still can get very unlucky now, for a good example, the odds of getting triple tails on a skill in the prior system would be a 2.7% chance, but nowadays it would be a 0.0125% chance, or 1 in 8,000. I remember when I was going through Railway 1, I was pretty off-put by just how well I was rolling, and when I later learned of the sanity bug being fixed that patch, it all made sense. Granted, that update also bugged abnormalities to have unnaturally high heads chance too, but if we were to go into every single bug, we'd be here for hours upon hours. These sanity changes end up being pretty important for Limbus as a whole, as a reduction in the amount of impact left to luck is a very positive thing. Sanity is far from being a perfect system, of course, since even now that 5% chance of failure is always lingering over you, but it's so much better now. I know I'm dwelling on a lot of the really early Limbus bugs for quite a bit, but that is because there are a lot of really funny bugs from early Limbus. There's a lot of really funny bugs in general, though, but I'll try and only have one more of the very early ones. This one I do consider to be a pretty important one worth mentioning, because it's something that was added to the game at a later point somewhat, that being discard. To explain the bug simply, if you were to slot into a defensive skill for a Sinner's bottom slot, but then use the skill in the top slot, the skill underneath the defensive skill would effectively be discarded, instead of how it works now where the skill is saved. Funnily enough, this bug was supposed to have been patched a few weeks before Railway 1, but for one reason or another it managed to still exist in the code. However, 1 week after Railway 1, it was in the patch notes once again, and this time it was put out of its misery for good. So if you go back and watch some of the speed clears for Railway 1, you might see this bug being used to some degree for faster skill usage. Overall, ended up being a very strong exploit that did deserve to get patched out, as the game is mainly designed around not getting too many skill 3s in order to counterbalance their strength. Discard did eventually make a more formal appearance a few months later when we got the Molar Office IDs and DHE Rodion. We haven't really seen too much discard in Limbus overall, but for the units that do have it, being able to cycle through skills incredibly fast makes them very good at their job. You may notice there's something a little strange going on. You can basically just infinitely use a skill in a single turn. I just wanted to show this off because I thought it was funny. Why is it increasing in power? What? Why is it at 52? Is it 60th? Okay. An 85. Alright. Another very comical form of bug that has happened a few different times is skill reuse bugs. For a period of time in October of 2023, if you went into a folks encounter and performed a very specific series of inputs, you'd be able to queue up a skill without actually using the slot up. What you had to do exactly was you had to click the top skill, click the bottom skill, and then drag it to the desired enemy part, and then after letting go, you click on the target enemy part again to unslot the skill. However, despite being unslotted, it still would queue it up, and you could just repeat this over and over again to keep on queuing up more and more of the top skill, resulting in insane damage outputs doable in a single turn. And even more insane, because it counts as the same skill each time it gets used, the skill starting power is the final power from the previous skill usage, resulting in the power getting larger and larger. Queue it up enough times and pull it against an unkillable enemy such as Hurtley with Surgery, and it can get really stupid. This glitch was seen as a big enough issue that once it was made widespread enough for PM to know about it, Refraction Rally 2 was full-on closed for a couple of days, up until the next weekly maintenance where they could patch out the exploit. PM went out of the way to try and delete turn count records for Rally 2 that had impossibly fast turns, like one turning a lot of fights, as they likely were abusing the bug, and they even added a new reward to Railway 2 that you would only get by clearing it after the fact, just a way to make sure people who skill reuse spammed the Railway 2 wouldn't have gotten everything from it. This is far from being the only time we got a bug resulting in insanely high rolling skill spam, as a very similar case happened in August of 2024, although this time it only worked for counters and only in certain encounters. If one of your sinners used a counter and hit an enemy with a counter of their own, it would create an infinite loop where both the sinner and the enemy would keep on getting their counters back and using them again. This bug was not nearly as abusable since it only worked in certain fights, and only IDs with counters, but it definitely was pretty similar to the one from the past. And in this case, we do have a little bit of an inkling as to just why this bug happened, namely if we take a look at the timing of it. Wild Hunt Heathcliff's release was 2 weeks after the introduction of this bug, and Wild Hunt Heathcliff was our very first instance of a clashable counter being added to the game. I don't know exactly how PM managed to break normal counters while preparing for the clashable counters, but the timing definitely feels too perfect for it to be unrelated. Of course, the bug was only patched after being in the game for a single week, but very funny to see something like Blade Lineage Kim or so going off, to put it lightly. One more instance of something similar happening, but not quite the same, is a strange case that only affected Lantern Dawn's skill 3. The same update we got Devi at Rodion in, back in September of 2024, Lantern Dawn's skill 3, titled Whirlwind Num, was broken in a pretty major way. The third coin of the skill normally works so that it gets a reuse if Dawn is under half HP, and only once per skill, of course. It's not something you can really make use of too frequently just because of how much healing Lantern Dawn gets, because her first stagger threshold is at 50% of her HP, but the third coin of her skill heals somewhere between 15 and 55 HP depending on how much rupture the target has, on top of Lantern Dawn healing for 6 HP on every attack against an enemy targeting her in the skill chaining phase. So if you manage to actually get Dawn to use this skill when low enough HP to end up below half even after all that healing, you can get this pretty funny animation where she just full-on takes a bite out of the enemy. Tasty. Where the glitch comes in for this week is due to PM breaking some part of the code in that 1 week time frame, which managed to get rid of the once per skill part of the coin reuse. What that means is if Dawn found a way to remain below half HP, even after the coin gets reused and she gets all that healing, it would get reused again, and again, and again. Pair this with something like giving Dawn a bunch of bleed, and she can keep on going until either she outpaces the bleed, or the bleed outpaces her. Unfortunately, she only sometimes used the biting animation, so it's not like she just keeps on eating the enemy, but it's still really funny to see a skill able to get so many coins, reaching the actual coin cap. My guess as to the cause of this glitch is like that it's due to Devi at Rodion, since it was the same update as previously mentioned. Deviant Rodion's skill 3 does have a conditional coin reuse on the final coin, although it's a on use instead of being on the coin itself, so PM might have rewritten some coin reuse code or something along those lines, resulting in a bug with how Lantern Dawn interacts with it, resulting in a very hungry Lantern Dawn. So, fun little fact I learned a while back, but there is a soft lock in the game that has likely existed for over a year now, but its conditions of triggering are so odd there's been barely any documentation on the antics possible. Shoutouts to Sonic Den 220 on Discord for being the one who showed this stuff to me and did the testing to find out about this. Now, what is it that soft locks the game? It's a very strange interaction with Donggrang Who Denies All. In the second phase of the Donggrang Who Denies All, aka the distorted Donggrang fight, he summons some trees and starts using a skill with a very unique effect. This skill steals a random buff from the target and gives it to Donggrang, which allows you to give Donggrang a lot of status effects that enemies are not normally allowed to have, resulting in a lot of varying but interesting results. Now, since it can only be buffs, aka status effects of the yellow names, you can't give Donggrang something like Surgery since it's a neutral status effect. Interestingly enough, despite being a buff, he can't steal Wild Hunt either, so there's probably some weird coding jank going on there. Shame, since being able to kill him instantly would be very funny. Some buffs can be stolen by him, but seemingly do nothing, such as Borrowed Time, where he isn't getting any of the buffs from it. He can get the visual effect from Charge Barrier, and he can get a bunch of shield from Penitence. For a really weird interaction, if he steals Tremor Clockwinding, it doesn't count as an amplitude conversion, since it's just stealing a status effect instead of triggering a conversion, so he gets both Tremor and Clockwinding at the same time. If you have the proper amplitude conversion, however, they will both get added together to whatever you convert the amplitude to. There's a lot of very weird interactions that Donggrang has from stealing buffs, and I'm sure I'm only scratching the surface. I'd recommend testing it out for yourself if you want to see what other antics are possible, but the only way to fight Donggrang Who Denies All is either at a 50% chance of the Under the Unchanging Floor and Mirror dungeons, or by going through all of the Kanto 4 dungeons, so it's definitely a little out of the way. But now, let's get to the real fun interaction. Ryoshu's Contempt Awe Ego has a unique buff titled Gaze of Contempt, in which Ryoshu gets a damage buff based on how much of it she has. At the end of the turn, Gaze of Contempt goes away, but if it was at a max stack of 7, Ryoshu gets Contempt of the Gaze instead the following turn. Not confusing at all. Contempt of the Gaze gives Ryoshu a stupid amount of aggro on top of 7 protection and 7 damage down, making her super tanky for a turn while reducing the damage she deals to be almost nothing. It's an interesting status effect that definitely can have its uses, even if it has a major drawback. Contempt Awe gives 7 stacks of Gaze of Contempt if there's a 6 resonance on Awakening, or unconditionally on Corrosion, so you can get it somewhat easily, even if Contempt Awe does have the most ego resource heavy Corrosion in the game, requiring a total of 22 resources to overclock, making it even more priced than overclocking Garden of Thorns. Now, of course, the question is, what happens when Donggrang Who Denies All steals Gaze of Contempt? You can probably guess based on the setup, but the simple answer is the game soft locks. When the status effect changes from Gaze of Contempt to Contempt of the Gaze at turn end, the camera just gets stuck, and you become completely unable to click on anything except for the menu button, leaving you soft locked until you exit out of the fight. Funnily enough, as soon as you do exit the fight, you can get a pretty clear picture of what the issue is, as the Contempt of the Gaze animation with the Spiral of Contempt's hands finally plays out. If you decide not to quit out of the fight immediately, however, the game's performance will start to get worse and worse until the frame rate starts getting really bad. I'm almost convinced there's probably some other soft locks or other weird situations that can be attained with this glitch, but this specific interaction is so niche and unlikely to occur in any situation, given that you not only need to use a high resonance Contempt Awe, but then you also need to purposely let Ryoshu get hit by Donggrang in order to let him steal the status effect, and you need to make sure Ryoshu doesn't have any other buffs that might get stolen instead. It's just a lot. This bug likely has been a thing ever since Ryoshu got Contempt Awe last year, but almost no one has discovered it due to its obscurity. Truly a 10 out of 10 glitch. No notes. All of the bugs up to this point have been primarily on the gameplay side of things, but back near the release of Kanto 6, there was a somewhat major bug with the story cutscene. Specifically, the cutscene that plays at the end of the solo Earl King encounter at 641. Here's what it used to look like. And here's what it looks like now. Now, it's pretty hard to see the difference when played like that, but if you put them side to side, it's a little easier. When Kanto 6 Part 3 first released, Merso's Chains of Others cutscene used the Gloom Ego color scheme instead of the Pride one. It's hard to differentiate the two sometimes, but if we compare them to the two Binds Egos and put them side to side, you can see how the Gloom one is a little bit more teal than the Pride one is. Now, this cutscene was quite the surprise when going through the Kanto for the first time, as not only did Merso use his base ego without being asked, but he did so as a Gloom ego instead of the normal Pride. This is the same Kanto where Heathcliff's body-type ego changes from envy to wrath mid-cutscene, so I had assumed that the Gloom Chains of Others was intentional and had some sort of significance from a storytelling perspective. However, I learned that this wasn't the case a little afterwards, as PM listed as a bug in the patch notes, and then changed it to what it seems to be the original intent of Pride Chains of Others, as it should be. This really is the only case I can think of for a bug that directly impacted storytelling, as a difference in sins for a base ego is kind of a massive thing. Usually if there are any issues with story stuff, it's pretty easy to tell that it's an unintentional thing, such as like a misspelling of words. The closest thing that comes to mind is how one of the CGs from Kanto 7 was intended to be animated, but was bugged on first release so that it would just be a static image. While it did get fixed shortly after, most people had already gone through that section of the Kanto, so it wasn't super widespread notice. I didn't actually know about that until recently, and I was pretty shocked by it myself, and I just kinda wanted to mention it here, just in case you didn't know too. That's a fairly different case from that of Merso's Chains of Others, though. Definitely a very odd thing, and it makes me wonder how they managed to mess up something like that. I suppose it is a little minor thing to notice visually. If it had been Pride originally, I might have still assumed it was Gloom just because of how light that Pride color is in the ego animation. There's only one more glitch I want to talk about this video, and it's my personal favorite of the bunch. Behold. Mirror Dungeon 4 was the introduction of the Tier 4 rocks, and the Sloth Tremor rock, Fragment of Inertia, was not calculated properly whatsoever. Part of the ego gift makes it so Sloth egos with Tremor deal additional damage based on how much Tremor potency the target has. It was supposed to be a max of 150% additive increase, but the numbers were not right, leading to situations like this. I don't know just how much of an increase in damage it is, but it certainly is a lot higher than intended. Sloth Tremor egos were turned into insane nukes against high Tremor potency enemies. Now keep in mind, this was when Mirror Dungeon 4 was first released, so there were only two Sloth Tremor egos in the game. Wishing Karen Dawn and Gregor's Suddenly One Day. Now, Suddenly One Day might have counted as Tremor back then, but that's because a few weeks later, Ring Yi-Song was released, and with that, all egos with random status effect infliction were changed to only count as a status effect when they actually inflict their respective status effect. Thanks to the fact that the bug with Fragment of Inertia was before the Ring Yi-Song change, Suddenly One Day was still a valid target as a Sloth Tremor ego. It's funny to think about the fact that there were only 1.5 Sloth Tremor egos back when this happened, because in the past year since then, the number has gone up significantly. We've gotten Cavernous Wailing, Everlasting, Asymmetrical Inertia, both Christmas Nightmares, and more recently, Crushbound Past. But thanks to this bug, Gregor Suddenly One Day became one of the strongest egos in the game, even if only for a single week in Mirror Dungeon, thanks to a massive oversight in the coding of a Tier 4 ego gift. Truly incredible stuff. That's all for the various glitches that I wanted to cover in this video. It really is just a compilation of the funny ones that came to my mind when I thought about it for a little bit. It also did add up to be 10 bugs in total, so consider it a top 10 of sorts. It's not really ordered based off of that, but it did work out that way. Although I did briefly mention quite a few other random glitches by proxy just while talking about those 10, so it adds up to be a little more, but that's cool. I'm also curious to see how long it'll be before the Dongrang bug gets patched, but it's really not an urgent bug whatsoever. Anyways, I hope this video served as either way for newer players to see a lot of the comedic glitches from days past, or as a way to remember some of them if you've been here for a long time. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!